Hey guys, and welcome back to Commander Adventures. As a heads up, there's a few minor errors in this game with life totals, and a misreading of a card which is addressed as it happens. However, it's still an interesting game featuring great commanders. First off, we have Rocco, bringing the walls to life with Arcades the Strategist. We then have George equipping for battle with Sram Senior Edificer. Danny will be resurrecting ancient legends with Hazezon Tamar. And finally, Chris is enchanting the world with Tuvasa the Sunlit. Let's jump in.
Rocco starts us off. He drops a Canopy Vista tapped and passes. George drops a Plains for turn and follows up with a Mana Crypt. He then follows up by casting his Commander Sram and passes. Danny drops a Command Tower and passes. Chris drops a Terramorphic Expanse and cracks it to go find a forest. As he searches, he passes off to Rocco. Rocco untaps and drops a forest. George untaps. He takes 3 damage in his upkeep from Mana Crypt. He then plays a Plains for turn, and taps 2 to cast a Dowsing Dagger. He gives Chris the 2/0/2 Defender Plants, and then draws off a Shram's cast trigger. He then pays to equip the Dowsing Dagger to Shram, and moves to combat. He hits Rocco for 4 commander damage. After damage is dealt, Dowsing Dagger triggers and transforms into Lost Veil. In his second main phase, George casts a Quietus Spike, and draws off of Shram. He then passes to Danny. Danny drops a forest for turn, and then casts a Farseek. He then passes turn as he goes to grab his copy of Sacred Foundry. Chris untaps and drops an island. He then casts an Argothian Enchantress, and passes to Rocco. Rocco then casts a Steel Wall, and without a land in hand, passes to George. George untaps 7 mana on turn 3 in a mono white deck, and then avoids damage from Mana Crypt in his upkeep. He drops a Makokoro, Center of the Sea, and then equips Shram with Quietus Spike. He follows up with an Onsera's Wings, and draws a card from Shram's trigger. He then moves to combat and hits Danny for 3 commander damage. George gains 3 life from lifelink, and then Quietus Spike triggers, cutting Danny's life in half. George then passes. Danny untaps, and drops a forest for turn. He then casts a target Vandal Blast to destroy Quietus Spike. He then taps his remaining mana to cast a Kadama's Reach. He grabs a Plains to hand, and a Mountain to the battlefield, and passes. Chris untaps, and then drops a Herald of the Pantheon. He then passes. Rocco untaps and is unable to draw a land. With nothing else to do, he discards down to 7 and passes. George untaps. He takes 3 in his upkeep for Mana Crypt, and then draws for turn. He drops a Plains for turn, and then taps 8 to cast a Parhelion 2. He draws a card off of Shram since it's a vehicle, and then swings 3 commander damage in the air at Chris. Danny untaps, and then drops a Clifftop Retreat for turn. He casts a Reclamation Sage to destroy Parhelion, and then passes to Chris. Chris draws, and casts the Telepathy. He draws a card off of Enchantress, and then gains a life from the Herald of the Pantheon. Each of his opponents then plays with their hands revealed, and Chris mistakenly reveals his hand as well. He then drops a Lumbering Falls for turn, and passes to Rocco. Rocco draws for turn, and still does not have a land. He discards down to 7, and passes turn. George untaps, and then takes 3 damage in his upkeep from Mana Crypt. He plays a Plains for turn, and then casts a Hero's Blade. The table makes a mistake here. They misread Hero's Blade, and automatically equip it to Shram as it enters the battlefield. In reality, it only triggers when a legendary creature enters. George should have paid for the equip cost. This happens once more this game. George then draws his card from Shram. George casts a Loxodon on Warhammer, and draws another card from Sram. He then equips Sram with the Warhammer, and grabs some dice to make it easier for everyone to see Shram's power and toughness. He then moves to combat, and hits Rocco for 9 commander. He then passes turn. Danny untaps, and drops a mountain for turn. He then casts an Omnath, Locus of Rage. Chris untaps, and draws. He then realizes he didn't have to reveal from telepathy. He casts an Energy Flux as an attempt to answer George, and gains a life and draws a card on cast. He then drops a Hinterland Harbor for turn and passes to Rocco. Rocco ultimately decides to pay to keep his wall. Without a land again, he passes and discards down. George untaps. He takes no damage from Mana Crypt on his upkeep, and then pays to keep all of his artifacts. He drops a Temple of the False God for turn, and then casts No Catcher of the True. He then moves to combat, and decides to put Rocco out of his misery. Danny untaps and draws. He plays a Plains for turn, and triggers Omnath to create a 5/5 elemental. He then casts the Temp with Discovery. Chris goes to search his library for a land card, while Danny searches for 2. Chris finds a Temple of Plenty, and Danny grabs the City of Shadows and a Gaia's Cradle, and then creates 2 additional elementals. He then casts his commander, Hazezon. Chris untaps. He then drops a Verduran Enchantress for turn. He then casts the Blind Obedience. He gains a life and draws 2 cards from his triggers, and then drops a Forest for turn. As Chris moves to end step, George casts a Swords to Plowshares on Omnath. Omnath is exiled, and Danny gains 5 life. George untaps. He then loses 3 to Mana Crypt on his upkeep. He pays for all his artifacts again, and then draws for turn. He then casts an Angelic Gift, enchanting Sram. He draws a card on cast, and then another card as it enters. He then casts a Steel Shaper's Gift that he drew, and goes to find a Masterwork of Ingenuity. He casts it, and as it enters, a copy of Hero's Blade, and once again the table misunderstands how the trigger works. George then draws off a Shram's trigger. He then moves to combat, and hits Danny for 12. At George's end step, Danny sacrifices Hazezon to City of Shadows, and adds a counter. Danny then untaps. On his upkeep, he creates 10 1/1 Sand Warriors, which enter tap due to Blind Obedience. He drops the Temple of Triumph for turn, and scries a card to the bottom of his library. He then taps Cradle to drop a Craterhoof Behemoth, followed quickly by a Beastmaster's Ascension. All of Danny's creatures then gain +15/+15 and Trample, and he moves to combat. He swings 77 at George, and Beastmaster Ascension gains 4 counters. George blocks an elemental with Sram, and after the dust settles, George takes 65 damage and gains 12 life, net losing 53, and leaving his life total at 10. However, they miscount and put his life total to 11. Chris untaps. He casts a Ground Seal, then gains a life and draws a total of 3. He then follows up with a Holistic Wisdom, gains another life, and draws 2 more. He then shocks in a Temple Garden, and uses it to cast a Luminarch Ascension. He gains a life, and draws 2 more, and then follows it up with a Heliod God of the Sun, once again gaining a life, and drawing 2 more. Recognizing that a board wipe is coming on George's turn, he hits Danny for 2 in combat. George untaps. He then pays to save all his equipment, and then sacrifices Mana Crypt. But since the trigger was on the stack, he must still roll for damage. He succeeds and takes no damage. He drops the Plains, and then immediately uses it to cast a Soul Ring. He then casts a Wrath of God, and in response, Danny sacrifices a Sand Warrior to add another counter to City of Shadows. After the Wrath resolves, George pays 4 to recast Sram, and both heroes' blades attach properly. At his end step, Luminarch Ascension gains a counter. Danny untaps, and pays to recast Hazezon. This puts the delayed trigger back on the stack, and he then passes to Chris as another counter goes on Luminarch. Chris untaps, and then casts Tuvasa. He drops a Bountiful Promenade, and then casts a Lignify Enchanting Hazezon. On cast, Chris draws a card from Tuvasa, and then Danny sacks Hazezon to City of Shadows to add another counter. Chris follows this up by enchanting Sram with the Darksteel mutation. Once again, he draws on cast, and then George's commander becomes an indestructible insect. George untaps, and then pays to keep his artifacts. When he reaches his main phase, he remembers Sram as an artifact creature thanks to Darksteel mutation, and chooses to sacrifice him. George then recasts Sram, re-equips the hero's blades, and passes turn. Danny untaps, and then gains 11 tapped 1/1 Sand Warriors. He casts an Ogre Battle Driver for turn, and then passes. Chris untaps, he casts a Banishing Light targeting Beastmaster Ascension, he draws from Tuvasa, and then Ascension is temporarily exiled. He then moves to combat, and hits Danny for 9, eliminating him. In main 2, he plays Sigil of the Empty Throne, and remembers to put his counters from the last round on Luminarch Ascension. George untaps. Similar to last round, he pays to save his equipment, and then sacrifices Soul Ring. He plays a Plains for turn, and then casts a Return to Dust in his main phase, choosing to exile Chris's Luminarch Ascension and Energy Flux. He follows up with a Danitha, he then moves to combat, and swings 8 commander damage at Chris. Chris blocks with Heliod, and then George passes. Chris untaps. He casts a Seal of Primordium, draws a card, and creates a 4/4 Angel. He then destroys one of the 2 heroes' blades. He then moves to combat, and swings lethal at George. Game review. This game was a lot more back and forth than it looked like it would be from the first few turns. George jumped out to an early lead, and was a real threat with his commander, and quite a spike. He was looking to quickly close out the game, but Danny showed just how powerful targeted removal can be against aggressive decks. Speaking of Danny, he was never completely out of this game. And if he had been able to remove Blind Obedience before he created his Sand Warriors, he could have easily dropped Craterhoof and overran both George and Chris. It's a shame Rocco fell so far behind on lands. Arcades can be a very explosive deck, but it's completely dependent on having the mana to support his casting cost. Chris showed the strength of Tuvasa here. With only one real board wipe in the game, and all the removal going towards keeping George in check, he was able to bury his opponents in value, typically drawing 5 or more cards in a turn. Finally, Blind Obedience was a clutch play against his opponent's creature-heavy decks, opening the way for him to eke out a win. As normal, I'd like to thank all the players for being a part of this recording, and a shout out to Dungeon Games in Fort Myers for allowing us to film. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know by liking it and leaving a comment down below. And be sure to subscribe to see more of our Commander content. I look forward to seeing you next week, where we return to some classic Commanders, and as always, thank you for watching.